beyond their control. We thank you just for the awesome privilege it is to be part of that in different ways. Pray that this time would be helpful to us, that it would be a time of reflection and honest evaluation maybe of what we're doing or thoughts about what we could do going forward. And just thank you for the faithfulness of each one represented in this room, and pray that you would be in control of my words, that you would filter them for me, and help this time to be something that really does benefit all of us as we learn together. Thank you. In Jesus' name. Thanks. So my name is Rachel. Just a couple moments of introduction about myself so you know where I'm coming from. I work with IAFR, the International Association for Refugees. I've been working with refugees for about 17 years with some breaks in there along the way, starting in Athens, Greece, and then after a hiatus and working from the academic point of view on immigrant history. Then I went and was working in Italy with my husband, Tim, where we were there for 6 years and got to launch a refugee welcome center that's still functioning there in Rome. And then we moved to England. We were there for 3 years, working also in a highly dense immigrant and refugee community. And then our visas were canceled, long story, and we made a quick change. And 18 months ago, had to uproot ourselves, had our own very tiny version of a refugee experience, very, very minor compared to what most of our friends have been through, but ended up in Minnesota of all places, which is not where I'm from. So I'm now working in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and my primary role at the moment is in equipping and resourcing churches and mission groups who want to engage with refugees around the world. So I work primarily for myself in North America and in Europe, and still involved with our refugee ministry in Italy. So that's a little bit of where I'm coming from. So I've had exposure to refugee ministry in several different contexts, and a lot of what I'm bringing today comes from those experiences, some of the good, the bad, and the ugly. I want to say before I start that I'm going to start with some positive thoughts about what a Christian witness looks like in the midst of a humanitarian crisis. I'm also going to go bring up a couple of issues that are areas that are common challenges or stumbling blocks that I've seen over my years of exposure to refugee ministry. Please hear that I want to in no way malign anything. If any of the things that I mentioned represent what you do, I am not trying to criticize what anybody's approach is. I stand on the shoulders of people who've made many mistakes. I've made a million mistakes, and God in His mercy redeems our folly and brings so much good out of it. Can I hear an amen? Amen. Thank you. Okay, so this is not a personal anything for anybody. It's just hey, I think if I could say one thing just to start, it's that good intentions by themselves are not always enough. Okay, so you can have all the good intentions in the world, but having a reflective process in your practice of refugee ministry will help protect you and help protect the people you're trying to serve from undue harm. So that is where my heart is coming from. I hope you can hear that. So some with good intentions fail to speak of Christ. Some with good intentions speak in a way that wounds and closes doors. So I'm looking for the place in the middle, in a way. I'm trying to live between these tensions that I have experienced, and in my own ministry I've kind of swung on different ends of the pendulum for different seasons, and I'm looking for what it looks like in the middle. What does it look like to hold a faithful Christian witness in the midst of people who are really truly in crisis? And I think there's some unique things to be considered here. So, starting points today, we have 3. Hopefully. Yes. I have 3 starting points. The first one is this is not a one-size-fits-all method. I'm not here to give you a specific how-to steps 1, 2, and 3. It's context dependent. What does a faithful Christian witness look like in refugee ministry? It looks like a million different places, just like there are a million different, 65.6 million, in fact, forcibly displaced people in this world. So this is not a one-size-fits-all. It's a very complex topic. But I want to say, as a starting point too, that the good news of the kingdom really is good news. And sometimes in our work we get weary and we lose sight of that, to be really honest. But the good news of the kingdom is really good news. And if we have a strong foundation in what the gospel is and what the goal of our work is, that'll go a long way in protecting us from being either weak, ineffective, or somehow damaging in our attempts to be a witness. God is on a mission to reconcile all things to himself. This isn't news to you, but I just want to remind you as I remind myself every day, God is on a mission. Colossians 1, he is bringing all things into reconciliation with himself, all peoples, cultures, the entire cosmos. That is good news, okay? Nothing is left out of the revolution. And when you're part of the kingdom of God, it radically transforms your relationships. It radically transforms the way you relate to God, first and foremost, but it radically transforms the way that you relate to the people around you. It should be a transforming agent in every relationship in your life and how you view the people around you. Christ invites us into new life and hope. He invites us into inclusion in a new community. It's not just an individual faith. This is a whole life, radical transformation of everything about you, your community, and everyone around you. And that, to me, is good news. We're called to care for those on the margins. We're called to make disciples. We're called to love God and neighbor. We want the good for our neighbor in every regard. And the Good Samaritan is one of my models for that. No worries. So I could talk all day about those things, but I think those are things that hopefully we have in common. And so I'm just rushing through them to say that's where I'm starting from. That's where I'm coming from. So the good news of the kingdom is really good news. Third starting point that I have here is that our posture really matters. So in our attempts to have good intentions but to do no harm in the process, I think our posture is one of the key things to having a faithful Christian witness in refugee ministry. So what do I mean by posture? I put up 3 words there. That's a dictionary definition of posture. That's not actually a dictionary definition. That's Rachel's definition of posture. Sorry. The dictionary definition of posture is way, approach, or attitude. Rachel's definition of posture is motivation, character, and approach. These are 3 things that I think will be helpful to keep in mind as we approach this topic. First, just to say that our motivation, I think first and foremost and really only, needs to be faithful obedience to follow Christ in what he's called us to do. That doesn't sound radical, but again, sometimes we lose track of that over time. My motivation is not success. My motivation is not numbers. My motivation is not conversions. My motivation is not even affecting change, even though all of those are good things and things I would like. My motivation is faithful obedience to Jesus. And if he's the one who does those things, he's the one who changes hearts and souls, he's the one who changes communities, my job is faithful obedience to him and who he is and what he's called me to do. Under character, I'd highlight that the first tool of anybody engaging with refugee ministry should be humility. That when you engage with this topic from a humble place, when you realize that the power to do what you do and the results of what you do belong to God and God alone, I think you're off to a good start. When we acknowledge that we're dependent on wisdom from the Spirit, I think you're off to a good start. Gentleness and respect, 1 Peter, be prepared to give an answer to the hope that you carry, but do so with gentleness and respect, right? Servants first. We follow Jesus, and what is the first description of Jesus? He was the servant king, right? Philippians 2, he emptied himself. We also seek to empty ourselves and to follow in the way of Jesus as servants. I think the other thing that goes under character is patience. Cross-cultural work is long and hard, and there are many barriers between us and the people that we seek to love. And even with the best of intentions, and even with the best of methods, we do things that wound along the way. And some of that happens because there's gaps. I kind of picture sometimes when I'm talking to somebody who's coming from a very different place from myself, like there's a brick wall between us. There's a brick wall that's built between cultures and values and language and all of these things. There's also a brick wall that comes from trauma. When you're dealing with people who've been deeply, deeply traumatized, sometimes you can say all the right words and they're hearing something totally different, right? I can say all the right words and you probably all will hear it totally different. We have that problem even with people whom we share much in common. So yet even more when we're working with refugees. I think there's like this wall, and not to be discouraged by it, to be patient and to realize this is long, steady work. And if you have a long-term view and you approach it with that humility and with that posture of gentleness, with the idea of being a servant first, and with that patience, I think that there's so much good that can come. sometimes the best thing we can do is to teach the unseen through the seen. By living out our faith in a holistic way in front of people, we embody what Christ is like for people, and sometimes that might be the only thing that they can see or hear. So, motivation, faithful obedience. Character, that humility, gentleness, a servant attitude, patience, and the approach, I throw out 3 words: relational, invitational, and pastoral. Seeking to be shepherds and priests, people who bring people to God, not trying to be God to people, right? Seeking to invite people into God's kingdom, into that radical transformation of everything about your life and how you live. Not trying to correct their way of being because we have it all figured out. So these are my starting points for what an effective Christian witness looks like. For some people, that's really frustrating because they're like, but what does that mean? How do I start? What do I do? If you're looking for that, let's have an individual conversation. Because like I said, this is all context dependent, not a one size fits all. But I hope these are helpful thoughts. I believe that the reality of a God who sees and hears and cares for us and actively makes himself known changes everything. And it changes everything for us, and it changes everything for a refugee who's on that journey. And so my deep desire is that the refugees that I know and love would experience and know the love of the God who's revealed himself in Jesus. Absolutely. So I just came across this quote, and I loved it so much that I have to share it with you because it's just been such a refreshing piece of, it's like a cool drink of water to me. This came from a guy in Australia named Scott Higgins. I don't know if any of you are familiar with him. I haven't followed his work long, but I just came across this quote and I thought, yes, this is what I need to be reminded of. It says, "The Jesus of the Gospels calls us to belief in a God of love who is establishing his reign over our lives and world. To build our lives on the notion that Jesus of Nazareth was the greatest revelation of God in history. To live out of the conviction that Christ rose from the dead, is history's Lord and will return to remake our lives and world. To love our enemies, to lay down our lives for each other in love, to divest ourselves of wealth, to remain steadfastly faithful to our spouses, to value inclusive community over the exclusivity of family boundaries, to take the initiative in making peace with those who have offended or wronged us, to abandon the quest for revenge, to value the interests of others before our own, to seek justice for the exploited and oppressed, and to share the good news of the reign of God." I want to be a part of that. That is the holistic revolution that I'm talking about. And I think when we approach with humility and with a holistic view of what God wants to do in us and in the people we care for, we're starting in a good spot. So, turning a corner to some of the challenges that are quite common in refugee work, and this is particularly true in a place where there might be serious humanitarian crisis. So I'll get back to this in a few minutes, but if you're working in a context where the people you're interacting with don't know where their next meal is coming from, they don't know where they're going to sleep that night, they have that level of crisis, there's a particular power dynamic that comes into being in a helper role that can really trip us up and influence our Christian witness, and sometimes for the negative. So that's what I'm going to be addressing for the next few minutes. This quote, "It's a way of the world that when one man feeds another, he is that man's master." This was from Jack London. He wrote The People of the Abyss. This was written in 1902 after Jack London had spent several months living in the slums of London and examining what it looked like from the ground level of people who were just struggling to survive. It is the way of the world that when one man feeds another, he is that man's master. One of the complexities that arises often in refugee ministry that has a lot of humanitarian aid aspects is that power balance that comes from being the one who's doing the helping versus the one who's doing the receiving can change the way that your relationship works. So I'm going to talk about that now. I have a little diagram, if you can see it from over there, I'm not totally sure, to help us understand. First, I want to say this is representing the power difference between somebody who's in the helper position and someone who's in the recipient position. This could apply to lots of different contexts, but I'm specifically addressing refugee issues. The helper, in this case, their basic needs are met. They have freedom and choice over their lives. They have some influence on their circumstances. They probably have language ability in the culture they're living in. They have outside resources, even if they don't feel like it. They have financial and organizational affiliations. They might have a church community. They're connected somehow. They're networked. They actually know people around them. This is generally where a helper is coming from. Then we have a recipient who, by virtue of the situation, their basic needs often aren't met. They have low physical or economic resource. They have few or difficult options for the future. They're unwanted, outside of the host culture. They lack understanding of systems in many cases, and they may be experiencing language barriers. So these things aren't morally right or wrong. I'm not saying that it's right or wrong to be in the helper recipient position. In fact, I think power is part of the image of God in us, that he allows us to exercise and wield power in the situations that we live, but we better do it well. So it's not that it's morally wrong to be in the helper position, but if we're aware of it, it will help us go a long way in making sure that we are not harming people in the way that we carry out our work. So it's not wrong, it just is. We need to be careful to carry out our influence and use it for good and not for harm. So one of the issues that can occur when we have a really high power balance, and again, depending on your context, that power balance may be severe. When I've been working in Europe in places where we have people who literally have nowhere to sleep or eat that night, the power difference is massive, right? If you're working with people who've already been resettled and they're fairly well established, the power difference may be less, okay? So you have to think through your own context here. But one of the problems that comes when the power difference is really severe, and even if it's not really severe, but it goes unexamined, is there's a few different risks. I'd put up just a warning sign. This isn't a stop sign. This isn't a don't do anything. This is just a, hey, slow down and think. And let's reflect together for a minute. 2 risks that I see possible when there's a big power difference. That is the potential for coercion and for opportunism. So coercion can be obvious. Coercion can be forcing, manipulating, trying to push out false fruit, as I put it. It can be rice Christians in the most extreme situation. I'll give you this bread if you accept my message, right? But it can also be a lot less obvious. It can happen even when the helper is not aware of it. It can happen when the helper has no intention of coercing anybody at all. So imagine yourself as a parent in a remote village living in country Z that does not exist. You're a parent living in this remote village. There's a local school, but the local school can't afford paper, pencils, or basic furnishings. You're deeply concerned about the education of your child and what their future will hold, as you've spent your whole life in subsistence farming, and you'd like to give them more opportunities. A Buddhist NGO opens a school in your village that has all the basic equipment for classrooms. They offer to feed your children lunch, a hot lunch every day if you enroll them. And you realize that they will probably discuss Buddhist ideals and practice if you send your kid to this school. And that runs counter to the values and worldview you've been working hard to instill in your child. Yet, this is a real chance for them to have access to a fruitful education. So what will you do? Or, let's take it to a North American context and something that might hit a little bit closer to home. You promised somebody to lead them to a good job if someone signs up for your Bible study. Okay? We don't need to raise hands, but I'm sure that some of you in this room have seen similar things. If you want to get a job lead, you can come to my Bible study and I'll help you get a job lead there. Okay? Now that person's intention might be fabulous, but there's a lot of risk there, I would say. We'll unpack that more in a few minutes. So I think there's the potential for coercion, even when we don't intend it, when there's a big power difference. I think there's also a risk of opportunism. So when I say opportunism, what I'm thinking about is, again, because most of my experience has been in Europe, working with asylum seekers, we've had many, many people who've made professions of faith to Jesus because they know that doing so will give them a better chance of getting their asylum application met. We've had thousands of people make confessions of faith to Jesus in genuine ways, and beautiful things are happening. But we've also had some people who, because of the dynamics, have been tempted to try to play along with it because it ups their chances and they know it. Okay? So that's what I'm thinking of opportunism. Again, every context is different. If you're working with somebody who's already resettled, they already have permission to stay permanently and they're safe in terms of politics, they may not have that same type of temptation to coercion. But you can imagine everybody's context is different in this room, so I'm speaking generally. If you were working with asylum seekers in North America, there could be more of that dynamic potential, where they might be looking to help bolster their case in some way. I had the opportunity and privilege recently to walk with my husband with a young couple who had come to Christ from a Hindu background while we were living in England, and they had, and you think that wouldn't be a temptation for opportunism, but we really had to do a lot of soul searching both ourselves and with them as we walked through a baptism process with them, because we knew that they were intending to apply for political asylum. So we weren't sure, and we can't know. We can't know the motives of their hearts or the genuineness of it. We looked for fruit. We tried to do our due diligence. We did a lot of discipleship before, during, after, but we went ahead and walked through with that baptism. But we had our eyes wide open thinking, we don't know. And I can't guarantee or safety guard everything, but I think awareness goes a long way, and at least protecting both ourselves and the people that we care for from coercion and from opportunism. So I'm just trying to point out that we need to be discerning in what we do. So for the next part, I have a case study that I would like to have you discuss at your tables. I don't think I have quite enough for everybody to have one, so I'm just going to plop a few on each table. It should take 3 minutes to read. I'm actually going to read it aloud for the sake of the recording that's happening, so that if anybody's listening at home, they have the chance to follow along. So I'm going to read it out loud and then ask you to discuss a few questions at your table in reflection of that. So is everybody within reach of one? Because I have a couple extras. You're good. Okay. Okay. In a large city, a group of missionaries and church volunteers work together to run a hospitality center for refugees and asylum seekers in a rented building downtown. They offer food donations, free season-appropriate clothing, tutoring for kids, and language lessons to displaced people from more than 15 countries who are living in low-income housing in the neighborhood. Signs on the door advertise the times of these practical programs in several languages. 3 afternoons a week, they open the space for refugees to drop in for a cup of tea, and during these times, they offer Christian after-school clubs to give weary parents a break. Since people from Hostrasi land, that I made up, have historically been the most open to the Christian message, they have developed a weekly meal for Hostrasi speakers only. When the staff meet a refugee of this background who seems particularly friendly and open to relationship, they are invited to this special meal. At the meal, tables full of Hostrasi families are fed culturally familiar food while a religious film shows on the big screens on the wall. As the meal ends, a Hostrasi believer gives a testimony about meeting Jesus and asks anyone who wants to follow Jesus to come to a back room where they can be given literature. Those who come to the back room are invited to further small group gatherings at the center where they can engage in Bible studies with a family-style meal. They are also given access to classes where they can learn to sew or get help with their resume and job search. Twice a year, the Bible study participants are invited to attend a retreat organized by the staff where they receive intensive Christian teaching and have the chance to be baptized in front of their peers. The retreat participants receive free visits with medical staff, and the kids can laugh and play while participating in fun and educational programs. These families begin to flourish on every level, spiritually, physically, socially, and economically. Again, if this bears any resemblance to anything you or anybody you know does, please take no offense, because actually there's some really good stuff happening in this case study. This is not a case study of everything to do poorly. This is not an example of everything going wrong. There's some really great stuff going on here. There's also some things that make me kind of wonder, or I have questions about if we're thinking through this lens of some of the power difference and potential for coercion. So that's what I'd like us to think about together for a moment. So if at your tables you could have a conversation about these two questions, I'm going to give you 5 to 7 minutes, and then I'll ask for some feedback from your tables. So the first question is, what are the strengths of this ministry? Like I said, there's lots of really good stuff going on, but what are the aspects of their approach that might concern you, and why? Okay? So discuss at your tables, and then we'll bring it back together in a few minutes.
The strength that I find is that there is a systematic approach to really want to know Christ. Then there is a way to go through and have a deeper understanding of Christ. And also there is a practical help that is strength.
I think certainly one of the things is the all-around. No, it reminds me of us. Sometimes it's parents use it really
the food always comes out.
That's a great opportunity because those were that chapters at a young age like that. Just so I
Kids, children, they watch a lot of times and they did that because they are their own separate languages. You offered staff to so they have the afternoon tea times. Seems like they're doing something better than
Yeah, exactly. They should make that up. It's double-edged sword. One side is
I don't realize that wasn't being a lot of anyone but one side being better. So in how you make it actually something. So it's like that.
then you get to know. Oh, I think those are these that are coming in.
You see there's a lot of
everything provided.
Very definitely. The strengths of their weaknesses, the adjustment of life. Practically, they found out what they were looking at and they come into those.
So it's like that, because the refugees, for example, they don't speak English or they have basic English, but for people understand, they don't have it. So when they say they listen English, they say yes,
And I see that right here, this is more.
and they're getting better here. They're just getting better.
refugees, they have their own and they see us as
Sounds wonderful.
we are not able to provide things yeah, somehow thinking between. Another one is but there is more net there. Sometimes,
Your church.
Last year in Toronto. Tell me your name.
Give you 2 more minutes. 2 more minutes, we'll bring back to you.
Why you do this without forcing their religion? Because I was not with the religion, but and then my answer I received so much so that I can share it with you. But I don't understand. I don't know how much they understood what I said. Yeah. So if you don't force your religion, you'll get that kind of thing.
What are the concerns?
I've never been to those scholars in the name. Yeah, well, but I did spend some time in the garden. There was some. We lived in the world of like
different ministries that are
there was this interest.
I wonder if I can have like a church that was from this background.
Or church membership. And so here, it's sort of the levels of involvement. One step there are many people who go deep. Because the deeper you go, the more you have. So they're great understanding in some respect. They may have no idea what's going on. But so, I don't know if I can articulate this the best way, but it just seems to me that approach taking the whole, they kind of that's something. Risk seems always to be an
It's so hard. You do
Nothing, then nothing happens.
well, that's true. We mustn't do that. That's true.
Do something I would risk a suboptimal outcome.
Doesn't like a one.
Or you feel you probably part of
They're just going to
in terms of we might not have everything that everyone
Let's try to bring it back together. I hate to interrupt because I hear some good conversations happening. My apologies for the interruption. So I'd love to hear from some of the tables, if we can just share briefly together. First, what you saw, some of the strengths from this ministry in our case study. If we could just share, you can shout them out or raise a hand or whatever. But if there's something that you saw that you thought, wow, this is really great. I like this aspect of their ministry. There's lots of good things to say, so somebody throw something out. Sharon?
So they have a lot of resources that they can offer to the community.
Yeah, it's a well-resourced ministry. Great. Yeah.
Systematic approach.
Yeah, they're strategic. They're trying to be strategic, and they got a plan. They have a plan. Yeah.
They're able to reach the children at an early age.
Yeah, so they're reaching children at an early age, whole families even. There's great stuff there. Yeah.
It's a hospitable ministry to hospitable culture, possibly.
Yeah, it's hospitality based. That's good.
Trying to be culturally appropriate.
Yeah, they're looking. I think in the food and some of those things, they're looking for ways to be culturally appropriate. That's good.
They're bringing the different cultures together in the
Yeah.
community.
Yeah. Okay, so you see multiple cultures interacting with each other. Community that might be springing up from
I
that.
assume there's some American-born people there.
Probably. And we don't know exactly where our city is, although I'm
Right.
assuming it's in North America. It might be in Canada. Who knows? Yeah. Other things?
Some practical help.
Yeah.
The sewing, the classes.
They're addressing some practical issues. Good. Okay. Yeah. People are flourishing, right?
Right.
Like that should be positive. Like we want people to be finding growth and flourishing in all areas of their life, and that's happening at least for some of the people. So that's great. Were you gonna add that?
But people are coming to know the Lord.
Yeah.
I was rejoicing.
Yeah. There are people who are understanding who Jesus is and choosing to follow him. Now we shall go, yay! Okay. No. Hip hip. Yeah. Okay.
It doesn't say that they coming to the Lord, I think, or maybe I'm missing.
Well, they have the opportunity to be baptized. So it's implied. It's implied in there. It's not overt. Yeah. Thank you for pointing that out. But it's implied that there are people who are flourishing spiritually and having the opportunity for baptism. Okay. So any aspects that made you wonder? You don't have to have all the answers. We're not given all the answers. That's part of what a case study does, is it doesn't give you all the details. There might be some things you're like, well, I wonder if, or maybe things that you're just like, ooh, that's a yellow flag or even red flag for me. I'd love to hear what people are seeing.
I think that there's no transparency when it comes to telling people that, we're offering all
all this help, but at the same time, we're going to show you the Jesus film.
Yeah.
I think letting people know that you're going to show the Jesus film is, it's rebuilding their dignity. They've lost a lot of dignity. Without being transparent, it's just not helping them rebuild their dignity.
Thanks, Sharon. So just to recap that for our recording, so she's saying that there could be a lack of transparency in the advertising of what's being offered at some of the events, and how important it is to tell people what you're doing and what you're intending to do. And that's part of restoring dignity to people and giving them freedom of choice, which is really important. Thanks, Sharon.
Yeah, I just agree. Like to tell them who we are before we invite them.
Yeah.
Then when they come, they know where they are going, and they decide before they enter the place.
Yeah,
If
great.
they want to come or not.
So instead of saying we should be honest about who we are, right, and give people the choice so they know what they're coming into, and invite them with warmth and openness. Yeah. Here.
It could be happening, and with all these volunteers and missionaries, hopefully it would be, but it doesn't say anything about hooking up with people individually. So we're offering films and events and meals, but are the people being mentored? Are personal relationships growing?
Yeah. So it's not clear from the case study. We don't know whether there's personal relationships, mentoring, discipleship that's going on in depth, one-on-one. It's not clear from the case study. Good point.
People from 14 countries are not getting as much treatment as people from this special country.
Ding, ding, ding. So we have 15 countries. One of them is getting a lot of care, and 14 of them we're not sure. And that's a tough one. It's a tough one because there are limited resources and time, and sometimes for reasons of strategy, people have chosen to focus on people group specific, and that's a method and philosophy question. It's a complicated one, but it's at least a question to ask, right? What's that about? Why, how, and how's that being done in a way that gives opportunity to everyone?
To go along with that, mine was more of a wondering question. I wonder if they're partnering with others and sharing in resources with others who are engaging other cultures and communities.
Yeah.
As we seek to engage cultures and learn, sometimes we're limited in our capacity of scope.
Yeah.
But as the body of Christ, we can come together and support
Great.
one another in the various places that He's called each of us.
Good point, Shanna. So even if you feel like you need to focus on a people group, are you sharing resource and ideas and connecting in partnership with others? That's a great thought.
Working with indigenous leaders or pastors to guide the process.
Yeah.
Maybe could be better used as a channel to send them to the ethnic church that is developing within that city.
Yeah, we don't know. It isn't obvious from the case study, but that's a great question. Are there leaders from these refugee communities who are being invited and included, involved, and linked in this process, or is it sort of a thing unto itself? We don't know.
It creates a lot of division and jealousy between different people groups.
Yeah, when one people group is getting all this attention and love and there's 14 others who don't, then there's a lot of potential for competition and a sense of injustice that's not even maybe a sense, but could be real.
Two more words
Yeah.
for what I said.
Yeah.
Trust and hidden agenda. Like if we succeed to gain their trust, and they will not discover later we have a hidden agenda. We just like trust, bring them here, feed them. Okay, now we want,
And now we'll do
It's
this.
better to be just clear.
Yeah.
And this is very important because if we lose that trust, they will be more fundamental in their religion and they will be enemy for us.
Right. Thank you, Insaf. Well said. So we're building trust with people and we're breaking down those walls of barriers between each other, right? That's hard, long, slow, patient work. Said that at the beginning. But you can undermine that real fast if you're starting to build trust with someone and then you show up with an agenda that you were trying to sneak in or something. That can really do damage on the way, and it can actually counter our goal. So thank you. Great. Anybody else with a burning one, or I'm going to carry?
Well, I think I heard unintentional pressure.
Unintentional pressure. Okay.
That, because you did have that in this scenario.
Yeah.
And it doesn't look like that all these people understand what's going on actually with them.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't even speak language.
Right.
And I'm not sure if what they're doing is what we
that's
think
great.
that they're doing.
Yeah, so it's not just, we must be transparent about our agenda and upfront about who we are and invite people, and also do it in a way that we make sure they can actually understand. If you've posted it in Arabic for me, I won't have a clue, right? You could say, oh, well, I told her. I'm sorry, I can't read it. So there's that too, saying it, not just what we say, but saying it in a way that people can hear it, right? Thanks. Yeah.
So just a reflection, I think you mentioned this before, that we were refugees in this case and we were in their context, just reflecting on how would we feel about the way it's being done. Would I, if I was in their shoes, how would I feel? Right. And just really thinking about that. And so what strikes me around that is that if the film is showed very, very early on in the process, you get them in the first meal or the second meal, versus much later in the process after you've gotten to know them and you hear that they have a desire.
It's different when there's established relationship with somebody versus just kind of a programmed thing. So I'm going to carry on with that note because you're reading ahead in my notes here. Cheating, just a couple more. No, that doesn't. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I just know she'd been raising her hand.
Yeah, I also thought that we need to remember that people from these countries, they usually cannot say no. It's a culture.
Yeah, true. Yeah. There's a lot of cultural rules about how you say no.
Yeah, so if you are saying that you will be refugees, Americans are different, Western people are different. You know your boundaries, you know how to say no. But Central Asia, I would say, people will agree with you and do whatever you say, just because they don't want to
offend you. Yeah. Cultural rules around saying no are really, really, really important to understand. That's a key thing. So you guys are jumping ahead in a really great way. So I'm going to just it's good. You're reading my script without me saying it, which is perfect. That's good news. So just to keep naming some of these things, putting it in another framework, I kind of think of it as like balancing factors in a way. Like I said, power differences are real. Power differences aren't bad or wrong. They just are. But they're good to be aware of. They're really important to be aware of. And there's things that we can do that can help with that power balance. I call them balancing factors. There's things that we could do in this case study that could make it better. There's things we could do that could make it worse. I'd just like to point out a few things that kind of influence the way things are happening here, balancing factors. Here's a list, not an exclusive, not a comprehensive list, but a list of a few things that can actually increase a power difference, make things less effective and ethical, in my opinion, in a ministry context. So one of the things that can increase a power difference is if you have a monopoly on a particular resource, you have a captive audience. So if you are in a town and you are the only provider of dental checkups, and you're in a small town, you're the only people for 30,000 miles, who can do dental checkups, and you have a family who's living there, and they have a child with a rotting tooth, and it's causing them tremendous pain. You have a monopoly on that person, you have some power over that person, because you're the only solution for their thing. If they're living in a large town where maybe there's 10 different charities in town who offer dental clinics, then they have choice to say, I want to go to this one or whatever. They have freedom of choice. I have less concern in a context like that than I do in a place where people have the only access to a particular resource. And in Europe, with the recent crisis, this happens a lot. The churches or people with great intentions find themselves in towns being the only person who has winter clothing. So, and there's kids who are freezing and need winter clothing. What is that parent going to do to get their kid winter clothing? Whatever it takes. Right answer. Okay? And I would too. I'm a parent. I would too. However, I'd probably have some concerns on the way if the only people with winter clothing in my town came from a different point of view and were being really evangelistic about it. Okay? And not to say that it's wrong, but how are we doing it? How are we wielding that power? You realize that you have power when you're the only person in the room, the only person in your town with winter clothing. Okay, so monopoly on a particular resource can increase power difference. A position, and that goes with captive audiences too. You could take it to a different kind of context and say, you have people who are sitting in line for immigration appointments. They have no choice but to sit there and wait for their immigration appointment. And while they sit there, you decide that you're going to tell them, that you have a plan for their life. It's like they don't really have a choice but to sit there. Essentially, you still can have a captive audience in different ways. That can take a lot of forms. The position of the helper in the host culture, if you are working in your own culture and you are somebody from the dominant culture, this is a little bit different. But if you are working in a different culture or a different community where you didn't come from, what is your position in that host culture? Do you have more or less power based on various social factors? That's a long conversation we can unpack if we need to. Is the aid that's being given by outsiders or by people in positions of authority? When I say outsiders, I mean people who aren't in relationship. Whether that's a short-term team, whether that's somebody from, passing through who doesn't have relationship. If they're giving aid, it's one thing, or if it's the principal of the school giving the aid, it's a different thing. If it's the principal of the school giving the aid, but the only school in town, and this person has kids in that school, they feel like they have to say yes to whatever that person says because they don't want to risk their child's education. The position of the person giving the aid, there's cultural rules around the accepting or refusing help, which was brought up a minute ago. Really important. Whether things are done in the context of a big program or whether they're being done in relationship, in a highly relational context. If they're programmed low relationship type of help, that can increase the power difference because there isn't the same amount of trust. You're just a cog in a machine and we're pushing you through and doing this to you, treating people like a commodity or something. That can increase power difference. We can take a lot of these and turn them around and make them positives, things that lessen power difference. Again, I could make a long list here, but just to highlight a few. If things are being done in the context of unconditional relationship, where that person knows because you have been in relationship with them and or you have said it, I'm offering you this. I would love to show you this film. I would love to give you a coat. I would love to invite you into whatever. I want you to know that even if you need to say no, that I still want to be your friend and I still love you and that we're still going to get together next Tuesday for coffee. And this does not, if you can be really explicit, sometimes we have to be, to tell people that this is not, if you say no to me here, that doesn't mean our relationship ends, right? So if you're giving help in the context of unconditional relationship, that's a positive thing. It lessens the power difference between people. If you're working in a context where you have refugee-led or influenced, indigenous leader influenced or led approaches, I think that's a major protective factor in this power difference issue. So whenever I'm working in a refugee situation, if we have refugee believers from that context, they are my first and best people I want to work under and behind them, because they know what the cultural rules are. They understand what the dynamic is, and they need to be the leaders. And I want to be behind, supporting, doing everything I can as their champion. I don't need to be out front. Okay? So I think that's a really big thing. And then we've hit this several times, but this is so important and so simple in some ways to enact. Full disclosure advertising. Have you told people when they're coming into this ministry center what they're coming in for? Do they know where you're coming from, or your point of view? It doesn't have to be like, now before you come in, wait, I want you to know that you're going to get preached at. That's not what I'm talking about. But simple, just hanging a sign on the door in the languages that are needed, or making sure it's said audibly if people are not in a position to read, that you're just saying, we're doing this because we're motivated by the love of Jesus Christ. You're welcome to come to our meal. There are no strings attached. On a separate day, we offer this other program where we do talk about what the Christian faith teaches about this. We would love to have you come, but you don't have to come. You can say no all day and still come for our meal. Full disclosure advertising. I just said who I am, what I'm about. Everybody has an agenda. Let's own it. Everybody has an agenda. You have an agenda. Everybody has an agenda. To have an agenda is human. If you don't have an agenda, you're not breathing. You have an agenda. Let's own it. Okay? Everybody has an agenda. It's okay, but let's be honest about our agenda. Make clear. And it doesn't have to be threatening. It doesn't even have to be a big deal. No big threatening speech. Just a, hey, this is what goes on here. Here's what's offered. Here's the times it's offered. you can be part of this one without being part of that one. It's not like you have to sign up for this to get the full package. That, by the way, was one of my concerns in our case study, was that, I don't know if you guys noticed, that the people who are being given access to sewing classes and resume help and job search were only the people who had committed to follow Christ, right? I'm like, whoa, so then that's where you start coercing people, potentially, depending on your context. If you're the only place in town where they can get help with their job search, they may feel like, well, I'm going to say whatever I need to say to get my help with my job search, right? Another protective factor, being thoughtful about how we combine spiritual outreach and physical aid. Again, this is not a one-size-fits-all. Every context is different. There are places where those things can go together and be done carefully and thoughtfully. There's places where I don't think they should go together. And I'd say that an example of that is where somebody's life is in danger. When somebody is on a boat in the Mediterranean and the boat is sinking, you don't say, before you sink, can I just tell you about God has a good plan for your life, right? You save that person off their boat. And I don't even say that as I'm saving them off their boat, because they're in a moment of utter panic and they're drowning, right? So would I love to tell that person that? Absolutely. But is that the time and the place to do it? I would say not, okay? So I'm trying to be generous with my own personal opinions here, because I do think that there's a really wide range in everybody's context. But I'm just saying you should be thoughtful about how and when you combine those things. There's lots of philosophies about whether they should be done together or separately. Just to give an example from the ministry center that we started in Rome that we're still a part of, one of the ways that we found kind of a balance, because we had workers from all different organizations with different philosophies, and we were trying to figure out how to find a place where everybody could feel in good conscience like they were doing what they needed to do. It's an open door welcome center. Everyone knows we're Christians. They know that's why we're there. They know we love them because Jesus loved us and we think he loves them too. That is very clear. They know that they are welcome without any pressure, that they can come and sit and drink tea and charge their phone and chat and play games, and there's no strings attached. They also know that there's Christian literature sitting by the door in their language that they can read. They know that they're free to pick it up. They also know they don't have to pick it up. Nobody's passing it out at the tables or forcing them on them. It just sits there. And you know what the good news is? Every time the doors are open, somebody picks something up. And someone picks it up and someone else says, what are you reading? Can you read it to me? And then we end up having the Gospel of John read aloud in I don't know how many different languages. I've heard it in that room in front of all these other people. But it's not me doing it saying, now we're going to read the Gospel of John, right? It's somebody else who did it, and it's a refugee to a refugee. So I say that's fine, you know? So that I think there's ways of combining things that are more ethically helpful than others. But every context is different. Yeah.
Could I go back to the second point, the refugee-led?
Yes.
Sometimes that refugee could be into a very powerful position among them, and that could be dangerous too.
You're right. Thank you. That's a really good point. So she said, the refugee-led, the really good point is you need to know who you're working with too. It's not always safe, because potentially that refugee could be in a power position within their own culture. And I've definitely seen that with some of the cultures we've worked with. There's ethnic groups and hierarchy among them. And if you give privilege, you give access or power to people from only one ethnic group, they can prioritize their own people group over others. There's different issues that can come up. So yeah, this is not a foolproof plan, but great point. Thank you for pointing that out. Directly voicing, again, a protective factor, the freedom to participate or not participate in programs. Aid being given through peers with the same caveat that she just mentioned, that you need to know what's going on. When aid's being given through peers, we've seen a lot of that where we try to allow a refugee to influence how something's being given and find out that they're giving it to their friends and not anybody else, these kinds of things. So there's lots of complications there, but I do think that on the whole, it can be a protective factor to have refugee leaders who are influenced, but it needs to be done in trust and relationship and with an understanding of the dynamics within the people group you're working with. And I think aid being given through established locals with a long-term presence versus short-term teams is a good principle too. So we are almost out of time, so I want to just offer a couple more thoughts, and then I'd love to just take some questions or thoughts from all of you, because there's so many people in this room who could stand up here and give this talk or would have other things to say, and I'd love to learn along with you. So we're going to skip that. I think just the principle I'd leave with you is to be in a regular process of doing a self-check. Okay? Reflective practice is super important. So these contexts are rapidly changing, especially in a time of crisis, and it's really important to be regularly checking and asking yourself, and preferably in a team context where you can check in with each other and say, how do you think we're doing in these areas? Do you think there's any concerns? Again, put yourself in the shoes of a refugee. If you're forced to flee your home to a neighboring country, and the only people available to give you the things that you needed to sustain your life were coming from a Hindu background, what would you be concerned about? What would you'd probably take their help because you needed it, but what would you wonder? What would you go, oh, I hope that while I'm there they don't do, fill in the blank. Whatever that is, ask yourself, am I doing that, right? You just put yourself in the shoes of a refugee. I think it really, really helps. So we can ask ourselves questions like, how do your services look from the perspective of a recipient? Basic question. If I were the person walking in the door to the place where I'm working, and I knew that the people I was approaching had a different worldview, how would I feel about it? Do you think that the people you're working with feel compelled or concerned about keeping your favor in any way? Is there anything that you're doing, whether intentional or unintentional, that might communicate that they have to do something to keep your favor? That's a concern. Let's think about that. If one of the people you serve, this is another one, one of the people you serve were present when you described what you do inside your community, how would they feel about the language you use? This is a big issue among missionaries who I've heard do fundraising talks, and it's like, I'm helping all of these poor, needy, lonely people who are struggling to breathe. And it's like, okay, yes, they are in a place of great difficulty, but they are people with dignity. Yes. They are people who are more than people in need, who have so much to offer. They are our partners, our brothers and sisters. They are people with so much to give. So let's talk about people in a way that you would be comfortable talking about them if they were sitting in front of you. So every newsletter I write, every time I write a blog, every time I do anything public speaking, I try to think about the person I'm speaking. If they were sitting right here, would I feel just as comfortable saying what I am? If the answer is no, I don't say it. Because, again, if I put myself in their shoes, if I were the recipient of an aid program, how would I like myself to be spoken about? Language matters a lot. It matters a lot. And then connected with that, how does this again may or may not apply to where you're working, but how does what you do look from the perspective of the government or of a nonprofit gatekeeper in your community? What might concern them? So if you're working in a town, you have an explicitly Christian ministry, and you're in a town and the town government is kind of uncomfortable with what you're doing, there's healthy tension, that's okay. But are there, if they were saying, boy, I'm really uncomfortable with how you're doing this, I think that you might be being discriminatory in your services. You're only helping Hostrasi people. You're not helping all the others, Or I'm concerned that you're doing bait and switch. You're bringing people in for one thing and forcing something else on them. What would you say to them to show how you have done due diligence to try to protect the people you care about and yourself from that? What evidence could you highlight to show you're protecting the dignity and freedom of people that you serve? In international context, again, this may be a little bit different in North America, but if you are in any global context, it's really good to know that, like for the UNHCR or any of those large government groups, their primary concern is about the safety of the people that they're working with. So if you are doing something which they perceive could make the situation less safe for you or for them, they're going to get really nervous really quick. It doesn't mean that they hate you. It doesn't mean that they hate Christians. It just means that they're really nervous about a very delicate balance. And what are you doing? Have you thought about what happens when you light a match and throw it into that pile of kindling? That's just that's their primary, most people. That's a big generalization. Obviously, there's individuals who everybody has to engage with who might have other issues going on. But as a general rule, if you can show people coming from a secular point of view, I've tried to go to pains to make sure I'm not discriminating and protecting the safety of the people and the dignity of the people and the freedom of choice of the people I work with. You will make friends and partners rather than walls. So I think that that non-discrimination piece is really important. So, and then to take us back to where we started, I think when we're addressing these issues with reflection and we're willing to ask those questions and we're starting from a posture of humility, working in relationship, being servants, being invitational, being shepherds. I think that there's so many beautiful, I know that there's so many beautiful and good and redemptive things that can come from our engagement with refugees. I can't think of anything better in the world to do. That's why I keep doing this. I cannot think of anything I would rather do. But I'm really, really sold on doing it well and not just doing it half-heartedly or quickly or just kind of to get it over with. Let's do it and do it well and do it in a way that honors our Savior. So, we have 4 minutes for any burning questions or discussions, and I'm very happy to stay around all through lunch and chat with anybody who wants to. And before I go to questions, I just want to say I have some resources that are available over on the table over there. I didn't print 1 million copies because it would have killed like 3 trees. Okay, so I only printed a few. If somebody's like, oh, I need this today, you can have it. It's over there. There's 2 things. There's one that's 8 Principles of Ethical Evangelism by Elmer Thiessen, who's a Canadian professor from a Mennonite background who's done some incredibly great thinking on this. So he's got a paper that I printed out there. He's got a book that's coming out next year that'll be really helpful on this topic. So if you haven't seen that, feel free to pick it up. There's also another one that's called Christian Witness in a Multi-Religious World, I think, that was made by a coalition of different Christian-based groups. That's a really helpful document that talks about some principles we can agree on from a very broad Christian context on how to share our faith. So if those things are interesting to you, they're there. If the other thing is that there is this email sign-up sheet over here. If you haven't signed up for it, if you do, I will email you a summary sheet with some of my slides and my notes and those documents electronically. So if you want that and you haven't, please make sure you sign up on this list. Okay, go ahead, sir.
So thank you so much for what you brought,
Yeah.
and thank you for answering my question.
Oh, okay. Did I?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. Great. So,
I have this, this is important question for me.
Yes.
As I am serving with the refugee, do I give them my cell phone number?
Do you give them your cell phone number?
Yeah, it does mean my relation with them
Right.
is just like from 9 to 2,
right.
or my relation
That's
with
a
them
good
is
question.
24 hours.
Right, that's a great question. So I don't know if everybody heard that question. Stuff was saying, asked if she should give refugees her cell phone number. But what she's really asking is my relationship from 9 to 2? Or is it from 24 hours a day? That's a really good question. I have some thoughts. Are you going to address that? Or are you? Yeah.
I do have some thoughts on that. I think it depends on what you want. For example, I have both situations in my life. So for one, I teach ESL. And for them, I give them my email address. Okay. For another, I'm helping a refugee couple resettle where I live. They have my cell phone. And they've been told you can call me night or day. So
Depends on the situation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer.
Will the organization allow it?
Yeah, some organizations may have restrictions on it. I've never worked for one that had a restriction, so it was a discernment question for me. I think that's a good point. There may be different relationships. There may also be different seasons. And if I give somebody my phone number, I also have a silence function on it that silences it from 11 to 7 every day. I don't care who you are. So I think there's different ways of drawing those boundaries in a way that keeps us healthy for the long term.
Okay, one more question.
Yeah.
Do I make them adopt my culture, or I adopt their culture?
That's a whole nother table talk and stuff. Great question. She said, do I make them adopt my culture? Do I adopt theirs? We have another thought here.
Just another thought on that.
Yeah.
This is my personal belief that if they are choosing to come to a country, which I would hold this standard for myself if I was going somewhere, that I should be willing to adopt the culture, if it's a healthy one, of that country. But I also, with the people that I have relationship with from other countries, I'm very interested in their culture. And if there are things that I can learn from them, because my culture may not have all the right answers, then I'm more than willing to adopt their culture.
Yeah. I think two really big words that get thrown around that are really important. This is one where language matters. Integration versus assimilation, two totally different concepts. I don't think it's ever right to ask someone to assimilate, which means I want you to look and act and talk and be just like me. No. I think God loves all the cultures and there's good strengths in all of them. And also there's weaknesses in all of them. So integration, where we gain from each other's strengths, is always a good thing. This gentleman.
I just want to answer the phone thing.
Please.
Because if you are a caseworker, you need to open 24 hours.
Yeah.
Because sometimes there's emergency thing, they can call only the caseworker or whoever.
Yeah. Everybody's
but
situation's different now.
what we can tell, unless it's an emergency death and die situation or thing, you will not accept calls after 9 or office hours.
Oh, you're 9, she 11.
Yeah.
Which brings up an important point about not being lone rangers.
Yes.
Is that you're not the only person that this friend is interacting with. So that if you don't answer their phone, they'll have another number. That's what
Absolutely.
churches and
Great, thank you, Gail. So that's a good point. I think that's a good protective factor in all of our relationships, is working in a context where you're not the only one who's holding the number. Yeah.
Just about the culture, you need to be able to help the refugee to settle into the host culture.
Yeah.
So that you wouldn't, that refugee wouldn't look really stupid or something else.
Okay, because there's 2 locations. Like, this is, the answer is, if the refugee came to America or Canada, then I don't want to use the control, but I will teach them, I'll help them to understand the culture they are going to settle and live in it. But if I am missionary, I work in Turkey and serving the refugee from Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan. This is, I can't make them adopt my culture because I'm here to serve them. I have to adopt and respect their culture and be open. Like, I train myself to be available for their, not depend of 2 different locations where we serve the refugee. This is, thank you.
Well, I just wanted to share, so I'm a missionary here from the Philippines, and I'm good friends with a lot of refugees within my area, in the Atlanta area, and I'm learning American culture, and so I tell my friends, let's learn the American culture together.
Yeah.
We both need to learn the American culture because we're living here.
Yes.
But at the same time, let's not lose our own culture.
Yeah.
So I always explain those things.
Great, good job. Thanks, Sharon. Yeah, so you're in a bridge position, bridging between these worlds. And I've been in that similar when living overseas, where you're kind of like doing this, and it's sort of like, it's like, let's learn together because I'm not really sure either. And let's learn, but let's not toss the baby out with the bathwater. I want to respect everyone's time because it is time to go for lunch, so I'm going to close it off here. But if you want to stay and chat, especially around these issues of the some of the tensions involved in our witness, I would be very glad to engage with you. And if you want to grab one of the resources, please do. And if you want them electronically, make sure you give me your email address before you go. And thank you for your time. Thanks for coming. Yeah.